Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you can leave a like and a follow for more content like this.
Chapter 11. Oberyn's Wrath. Due to the situation in the north, Dorne's reserve troops began mobilizing toward the northern border. Additionally, some noblewomen from northern military strongholds were sent to the safer southern regions of Dorne. House Dayne, one of Dorne's most powerful northern military families, saw Ashara Dayne, sister to the Sword of the Morning, temporarily take residence in the royal guest house at Sunspear. In the garden, Wright spotted the once vibrant Ashara, whom he had met at Storm's End, now pale and visibly pregnant. Seeing her dispirited state, he approached her to strike up a conversation. Perhaps viewing Wright as just a child too young to understand, Ashara gradually opened up, revealing her past. She had fallen in love with Eddard Stark at the Harrenhal tourney. At the time, Eddard was the younger son of High House, and she, a noblewoman, had an equally suitable status. They loved each other deeply, and Ashara was carrying his child. They had even discussed marriage. However, Eddard's world was turned upside down when his father and elder brother were killed. Overnight, he became Warden of the North. War erupted, and he was forced to marry Catelyn Tully, his brother's betrothed, to strengthen alliances with the Riverlands. To make matters worse, news of Eddard leading forces to attack Dorne had now reached Ashara, leaving her devastated. Wright, with his usual sharp tongue, berated Eddard as a traitor and heartless scoundrel, accusing him of abandoning Ashara and their unborn child. He continued his tirade until even Ashara could no longer listen and urged him to stop. Wright then softened his tone, explaining that Eddard had no choice. He broke down the situation after the deaths of Eddard's father and brother, the need for vengeance, the duty to rally the North, and the alliance with the Riverlands. Ashara's mood lightened somewhat as she listened to his reasoning. The Trident battle, now lacking Dorne's forces, resulted in fewer casualties for the rebels compared to the original timeline. Robert Baratheon emerged unscathed from the battle, which allowed him to personally lead the charge on King's Landing with Eddard Stark as his second-in-command. The Royalist forces suffered even greater losses than before, and news of their defeat threw King's Landing into chaos, shattering morale. Seeing the tides of war turn, Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, seized the moment. He mobilized his forces and marched on King's Landing under the pretense of supporting Robert. Striking before the rebels could regroup, Tywin's army breached the city walls and launched a savage sack in Robert's name. By the time Robert and his forces arrived, King's Landing had been ravaged. Robert and Eddard, along with their commanders, stormed the Red Keep, only to find Jaime Lannister seated on the Iron Throne with the Mad King's corpse at his feet. Amidst the chaos, Tywin's loyal bannermen, Gregor Clegane and Amory Lorch, had brutally murdered Rhaegar Targaryen's wife, Elia Martell, as well as Rhaegar's children, Prince Aegon and Princess Rhaenys. The Mad King's wife, Queen Rhaella, and Rhaegar's younger brother, Prince Viserys, vanished without a trace. Robert Baratheon ascended the Iron Throne, crowning himself king. Eddard Stark was tasked with leading the army south to relieve the siege of Storm's End. Wright and Renly spent a year residing at Sunspear. Wright used some funds to bribe palace guards. While it wasn't possible to leave the palace, messages could still be sent in and out. As for the city itself, centuries-old families had spies in each other's strongholds, so communication, though slow, was still possible. Wright maintained correspondence with Stannis and Robert, albeit with delays. During his time in Sunspear, Wright often thought of Ashara Dayne's brother, the Sword of the Morning. Inspired, he compiled the unique fighting styles of the four Sand Snakes into 4 separate books as gifts for the girls. With a mental age of 30, Wright didn't hold grudges against children. After nearly a year together, their antics had subsided, and he found the girls enjoyable company. Additionally, he planned to use these manuals to teach Renly later. This world had one major flaw regarding fighting style. They were entirely dependent on family traditions and passed down orally. While this ensured the protection of a family's techniques, it also made them vulnerable to being lost if a key individual perished. For instance, if the Sword of the Morning were to die, House Dane would potentially lose its legacy for decades, as history had shown. The 4 books were titled based on the girls' chosen weapons: Obara's basic whip techniques, Nymeria's introduction to throwing knives, Tyenne's fundamentals of daggers, and Ariane's basics short spear techniques. Each book included foundational physical training, simple injury treatment methods, and step-by-step illustrations of techniques, complete with instructions on execution, force application, countermeasures, and variations. Wright went further by breaking down each technique into individual moves, dedicating a single page to each. This systematic approach was unheard of in this world, reflecting on how even silly gimmicks like the 5-whip lightning strike could gain popularity back in this world. Wright found it a pity that genuine battlefield techniques here were at risk of being lost forever. History continued to unfold along familiar lines. Robert Baratheon declared himself King of the 7 Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm, taking the regnal name Robert I. With his coronation complete, he turned his focus to rooting out the remaining loyalist forces scattered across Westeros. Meanwhile, Wright began planning his departure from Dorne. As he mulled over the latest updates from the north, Nymeria and Tyene suddenly burst into his room. "My father is back! He's going to kill you! You need to escape with us now!" Nymeria exclaimed, grabbing Wright's hand in urgency, while Tyene looked equally distressed. However, before they could act, a large contingent of guards entered the garden, surrounding Wright and Renly. The guards from Storm's End, unarmed and unprepared, were quickly subdued with minimal resistance. Nymeria's hand was damp with sweat as she gripped Wright's, trembling visibly at the sight of the approaching guards. "Prince Doran has summoned Wright and Renly to the throne hall," the captain of the guards announced, gesturing for his men to seize the boys. Wright turned to reassure Nymeria, his tone calm and measured. "Don't worry. The prince isn't planning to kill us. He just wants to talk." Inside the throne hall, Prince Doran was locked in a heated argument with his brother, Oberyn Martell. Several ministers were seated nearby, while nobles stood to the side, their expressions tense. When Wright and Renly entered, Oberyn spun around and unleashed a torrent of fury. "My uncle is dead. My sister is dead. And her 2 children are dead. Robert is the murderer." Though unarmed, Oberyn's voice was as sharp as a blade, and guards with spears flanked him, their stances alert. Renly froze in terror, unable to move. Wright, however, noted that Oberyn had not acted beyond yelling, a sign that Prince Doran had likely explained the situation to him already. Wright and Oberyn's previous acquaintance was tenuous at best, forged only by Wright's connection to Robert. Their relationship was no closer than that of a university student to an elementary schooler. Now that enmity had arisen, Wright knew his magic could eliminate Oberyn with ease. But he also feared Oberyn's infamous penchant for poison, a danger magic might not be able to counter. "Your Highnesses," Wright began, addressing both Doran and Oberyn, "Prince Lewin Martell's death on the battlefield was honorable. As for the murders of the princess and her children, the true culprits are Tywin Lannister's men from the Westerlands." He paused, ensuring the hall absorbed his words before continuing. "Both of you are well aware of the situation at the time. The rebellion was primarily led by the North, the Riverlands, and the Stormlands. Meanwhile, Tywin Lannister and the Westerlands remained conspicuously neutral, refusing to take a side. This was a calculated move. Tywin was waiting to see which side would prevail before committing. Wright took a step forward, his voice steady and firm. After the rebels' decisive victory at the Trident, capturing King's Landing became inevitable. Robert had already issued orders to spare the lives of the royal family. But then, Tywin launched a sudden assault on King's Landing. Though he claimed to be fighting under my brother Robert's banner, his actions told a different story. The supplies and wealth he seized were all sent back to Casterly Rock, revealing his true intentions, exploiting the chaos for his own gain. Chapter 12. Father-in-law Wright looked Oberyn directly in the eyes. The events within the Red Keep must already be known to all. Jaime, as a member of the Kingsguard, did indeed kill the king. But it was Tywin's men, specifically Gregor Clegane, who murdered your sister and her children. At that time, only the Lannisters' forces occupied the Red Keep. Wright was confident the two princes already knew this. The information had been corroborated by Dorne's spies and nobles in King's Landing. The evidence was clear and indisputable. However, to diffuse Oberyn's rage, Doran had insisted that Wright, as Robert's brother, recount the tale again in the presence of the court, ensuring that both the nobles and guards could spread the truth across Dorne. My brother Robert raised his banners against the Mad King and Rhaegar alone. He never targeted Queen Rhaella or Prince Viserys. In fact, when they fled, he refrained from pursuing them. He kept his promise not to harm the rest of the royal family. This was an outright fabrication. Robert hadn't given the matter much thought, let alone issued such orders, but Wright needed to protect his brother's reputation. Doran's expression subtly shifted. The implication that Robert had deliberately allowed the queen and prince to escape was new to him. Oberyn's face softened slightly upon hearing that other members of the Targaryen family were spared. Doran glanced at his younger brother before addressing Wright. Your brother Robert has declared himself king of the Seven Kingdoms. The Reach and Dornish armies besieging Storm's End have begun their withdrawal. The Reach has already sworn fealty to the Iron Throne, but Dorne will not. Since its inception, Dorne had never formally bent the knee to any king of the Seven Kingdoms. Its allegiances were typically secured through marriage alliances, at most appearing to align with the realm. With a new ruler now on the throne, Doran felt it necessary to formally reassert their stance. Well, my brother Robert hasn't shared such matters with us children, Wright replied, feigning innocence to keep the atmosphere light. Everyone chose to ignore the unspoken truths, keeping the conversation civil. Now that the war has reached its conclusion, Robert and I have discussed the next steps. In 3 days, we will hold a betrothal ceremony. Marriages were often used to mend divisions following a war, a common method of reconciling warring factions. With the recent bloodshed, it was essential for King Robert and Dorne to restore their relationship. Under ordinary circumstances, Robert himself would have married a Dornish princess, cementing the peace. However, Robert had already reached an agreement with Tywin Lannister to wed Cersei. Tywin had retired to the Westerlands, while Jon Arryn served as the interim hand of the king. After consulting with his council, Robert had decided to rely on his brothers to strengthen alliances. As king, his siblings' positions naturally rose in prominence. Stannis, who had proven himself on the battlefield, was poised to be named a Lord Paramount. Robert had originally intended for Stannis to wed the Dornish princess, but Dorne opposed the arrangement. Doran's eldest daughter, Arianne Martell, was the first in line for succession in Dorne. Moreover, Doran still held hope for a Targaryen restoration, with Viserys Targaryen still alive on Dragonstone. He sought to keep Arianne available for a potential marriage alliance with the exiled prince. With Arianne as his only daughter and the rest of his children being sons, Doran remained steadfast in his negotiations. Both sides continued their deliberations, trying to reach a suitable compromise. Wright, understanding the situation, proposed that either Renly or he himself marry one of Prince Oberyn's daughters. Since both Wright and Renly were young and held no titles, their status naturally fell short of Stannis's. As a result, the Dornish party could lower their own candidate's status accordingly. With no daughters left from Doran's lineage, Oberyn had to offer one of his daughters. Though his daughters were born out of wedlock, Oberyn could officially declare them as legitimate heirs, granting them inheritance rights. After receiving this proposal, Robert discussed it with his council. Dorne agreed, deciding on a betrothal between Renly, who was 5 name day, and Oberyn's eldest daughter, Obara Sand, who was 10. Although the arrangement had not yet been publicly announced, the lengthy negotiations had resulted in internal leaks, and even the betrophal's participants were aware of the situation. The children couldn't keep their emotions in check. Renly, terrified of Obara's temper, threw tantrums and cried incessantly, refusing the match. His disruptions echoed through the guest quarters daily. On the other side, Obara told her father she wanted to kill both Renly and Wright. This led to a deadlock in negotiations once again. Faced with such chaos, Wright decided to sacrifice his own interests for the stability of the realm. He proposed marrying Oberyn's second daughter, Nymeria Sand, instead. The eldest daughter was too old and filled with murderous intent. However, Nymeria, who was only 3 years older than Wright, had always been more approachable. Importantly, her mother was a noblewoman, making Nymeria a high-born bastard. Oberyn had raised her as a legitimate daughter in his household. Both sides eventually reached an agreement. The betrothal ceremony will be held in 3 days in the palace banquet hall, Prince Doran announced. After the ceremony, the two of you will set sail for Storm's End. The nobles and lords in attendance smiled and offered congratulations to Oberyn. Wright noticed the transformation in the Dornish nobility's demeanor. Those who had followed Oberyn with angry expressions now wore delighted smiles. It seemed that power-hungry courtiers behaved the same everywhere. The ship's already sunk. Let them walk back, Oberyn muttered angrily as he stormed out. Though his temper had cooled somewhat, Oberyn was still fuming. Having displayed such fury earlier in public, he needed to maintain his pride despite the concessions. The day before the betrothal ceremony, Oberyn officially declared Nymeria his legitimate heir in the presence of her mother and several nobles, giving her the surname Martell. The ceremony itself saw the attendance of many Dornish nobles residing in Sunspear, as it marked both a royal betrothal and the end of the war. Wright and Nymeria Martell stood in the center of the hall, dressed in traditional Dornish attire, with Oberyn's third daughter, Tyain Sand, acting as Nymeria's handmaid. With Wright's father long dead, it fell to Renly to deliver the marriage contract, bearing Robert's seal to the witness, Prince Doran. Oberyn then stamped it with his seal as Nymeria's father, formalizing the agreement. The contract represented an unbreakable bond. Any side that dishonored it would bear the shame of betrayal and faithlessness. With the formalities complete, Renly cast off his earlier concerns and enjoyed the feast, eating and drinking to his heart's content. Nymeria, still young and only partially understanding the implications of the arrangement, seemed delighted. She knew that, when grown, they would live together and smiled often at Wright, occasionally stealing glances at him. The two followed Oberyn around the hall, greeting and drinking with various nobles. The next day, Wright, Renly, and their guards prepared to leave for Storm's End. With Oberyn having sunk their ship, they had no choice but to travel on foot. Oberyn, true to his pre-betrothal declaration, refused to rescind his orders. Wright would have to endure some hardships as a display to certain nobles, allowing them to vent their frustrations. No merchants dared sell them a ship in the city, forcing the party to leave Sunspear on foot and head west. Their plan was to first pass through God's Grace and then reach Tor to purchase a vessel. Meanwhile, Ashara Dane, returning to her home at Starfall, decided to travel with them until God's Grace, where they would part ways. Outside Sunspear's gates, Renly had already boarded a carriage, and the convoy was packed and ready to depart. No adults came to see them off. Instead, Princess Arianne and Oberyn Sand represented their fathers, silently watching from the side. Only Nymeria and Tyain stood in front of Wright, exchanging farewells. Wright retrieved a bundle from the carriage. Inside were the manuals he had written, each containing basic techniques interwoven with insights based on his own knowledge. These books were his parting gifts for the 4 girls. He handed the books out by name. Both Arianne and Oberyn accepted their gifts, their expressions softening slightly. Tyain, upon receiving her book, began to cry, knowing her close friend of a year was leaving. Wright gently patted her head in comfort. Finally, he gave Nymeria her book. "I'm only 5 name day and you're just 8, he said. "For now, we must part, but when I grow up, I'll come back for you." Nymeria nodded in agreement. Fearing that she might start crying as well, Wright quickly boarded the carriage and ordered the guards to set off. Chapter 13. The Journey Home. Dorne, though known for its vast deserts, boasts fertile lands and abundant rivers in its eastern regions, dotted with palm trees and lush fields. The convoy arrived in Planky Town and found an inn to rest for the night. With Ashara Dane being pregnant and no urgency in their travels, the group preferred a more leisurely pace. The war's end had brought peace between Dorne and King's Landing, reinforced by the royal betrothal. The guards of House Dane and Wright's entourage shared a hearty meal in the inn's main hall, laughing and drinking together. Meanwhile, Ashara, her maid, Wright, and Renly shared a quieter table. Though the food lacked the refinement of noble households, there was plenty of bread and meat to go around. The inn bustled with activity, as its proximity to Sunspear ensured good security. There were no brigands or mercenaries to worry about, only passing merchants and travelers. As they were eating, a bard entered the hall. He spoke briefly with the innkeeper at the bar, received a cup of wine, and then set up a stool in the middle of the room. Seated comfortably, he began to sing. Bards, always traveling, would perform songs, recite poetry, or recount tales wherever they went. They were instrumental in spreading the deeds of heroes, often immortalizing them in ballads or epic poems. Among the most well-informed wanderers, they were also invaluable sources of news and lore. In this world, taverns as distinct establishments didn't exist. Places that served food invariably offered drink as well. Innkeepers welcomed bards, knowing that the better the music or stories, the more guests would drink, and the higher the profits. A bard would earn their lodging through their performance, with guests sometimes paying extra for private recitations or stories at their tables. To signal their willingness to host a bard, innkeepers would offer a cup of wine after a brief introduction. Once accepted, the bard could begin their performance. However, famed bards often required payment up front. After finishing his first song, the bard announced his next tale, the story of Eddard Stark and Arthur Dane, the Sword of the Morning. Wright immediately ordered his guards to bring the bard to their table. Ashara clutched her maid's hand tightly, her emotions torn. One was the father of her unborn child, and the other was her brother. The guards gathered around, eager for the tale to begin. The story of Eddard Stark and Arthur Dane begins with Prince Rhaegar's participation in the tourney at Harrenhal, the bard began. Just focus on Eddard and Arthur, Wright interrupted. The bard, unperturbed, took a sip of his drink to moisten his throat. Stories drawn out with additional context often earned more coin, but he'd encountered impatient listeners many times before. This time, he would settle for a smaller reward. Very well. I'll start with why they met, he said. After Robert Baratheon ascended the throne, he sent Eddard Stark south to relieve the siege of Storm's End. The armies of the Reach and Dorne, having failed to breach the castle after a year, saw the tide turning against them. They negotiated peace with the new king and began their withdrawal. From captured soldiers in King's Landing, Robert learned that Prince Rhaegar had ordered the Kingsguard to take Lyanna Stark to the Reach. He dispatched Eddard, who was already in the south, to pursue them. Eventually, Eddard tracked them to the border of Dorne and the Stormlands. The Kingsguard, few in number, took Lyanna to the Tower of Joy. Eddard left his army behind and took 7 northern lords and knights to demand Lyanna's release. The Kingsguard refused to surrender her, and the two sides clashed. 7 against 3, the bard continued. Fighting according to the chivalric code. On Eddard's side, Lord William Dustin, Sir Ethan Glover, Sir Martin Cassell, Sir Theo Wool, and Sir Mark Ricewell fell in battle. Only Howland Reed survived, though gravely injured. Ashara sighed in relief at the mention of Eddard's survival, but her face remained tense, waiting for news of her brother. On the Kingsguard's side, Sir Gerald Hightower, their Lord Commander, and Sir Oswell Went fell first. In the final duel, Eddard Stark defeated Sir Arthur Dane. All 3 Kingsguard knights refused to yield, choosing death to protect their honor. After Arthur's death, Eddard personally delivered the Dawn Sword to House Dane, returning it to his family. The bard concluded his tale, but the weight of his words left Ashara devastated. Betrayed by the father of her child, who had also slain her brother, she wept inconsolably. Wright, uncertain how to console her, handed the bard a silver moon coin and sent him away. At dawn, the convoy resumed their journey. Ashara refused to eat and spent her days crying. A day's travel from God's grace, Ashara began to experience abdominal pain. Her maid suspected she was going into labor prematurely. Wright immediately dispatched 2 guards ahead to secure an inn and summon a physician, while the remaining party quickened their pace. The convoy had not yet reached God's grace when Ashara's maid screamed that her water had broken and she was bleeding heavily. Her condition was critical. Wright immediately ordered the convoy to halt. Despite being in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night, with no village or inn in sight, they could not continue. The carriages, with no suspension and traveling over uneven terrain, were far too jarring. Renly, too young to grasp the gravity of the situation, only knew that everyone around him was on edge. Wright directed the other carriages to circle Ashara's, with guards stationed at the perimeter. Mounted men rode outward, ensuring that no wild beasts drawn by the scent of blood approached. Inside the convoy, there were only 2 women, Ashara and her maid. Wright and Renly, both just 5 years old, were the only other non-guards. The rest of the men were soldiers. Wright, recalling fragments of instructional materials he'd seen in his previous life, and possessing healing magic, steeled himself to assist despite the breach of decorum. The maid, young and inexperienced in childbirth, was panicking. Seeing Wright as just a child, she reluctantly agreed to let him try. Entering the carriage, Wright was met with the sight of Ashara's lower body soaked in blood. He quickly instructed the guards outside to fetch water and start a fire, while sending the maid to gather soft cloths to staunch the bleeding. As the maid rushed off, the glow of Wright's healing hands magic filled the carriage, staunching the blood flow. Yet Ashara, having not eaten for days and overcome by grief, seemed to have resigned herself to death. For a woman with a will to die, even the strongest magic could only do so much. The maid returned with cloths, and Wright stood at the head of the carriage, directing her through the limited knowledge he had about childbirth. Before long, the cries of a newborn filled the night. Ashara, weak and barely conscious, held the baby girl for a brief moment before her arms went limp. The maid, cradling the child, turned to Wright and asked what name should be given. In this world, a child's name was chosen at birth, the day serving as both their naming day and birthday. Only the wildlings beyond the wall waited until a child was 2 to name them. Among the group, Wright and Renly held the highest rank as the younger brothers of the King of the 7 Kingdoms. Renly, however, remained utterly bewildered. The maid, having spent 6 months as Wright's neighbor in Sunspear, knew him to be wise beyond his years. As Ashara and Eddard were never married, the girl would take Sand as her surname, in line with Dornish customs for bastards. "Let her be called Ashara Sand, after her mother," Wright said, gently closing Ashara's eyes. The convoy finally arrived at God's grace. Ashara had passed away, leaving the Dane guards without direction. Wright instructed them to stay at the inn for the time being. The maid, with a guard's help, was sent to find a wet nurse and then dispatch a messenger to Starfall to inform House Dane. The remaining guards were to stay behind and protect the child. Wright decided to stay in God's grace for a few days as well. Ashara had been more than an acquaintance to him, and he couldn't bring himself to leave without ensuring the situation was handled properly. Chapter 14. King's Landing. After settling in, Wright stayed in his room, looking after the newborn girl. In the original story, this child did not survive, but now, thanks to Wright's healing magic, she had been brought back to life. She was still weak, but she had made it. Her mother's family were nobles. Though she was a bastard, Dorne's customs were more open-minded than the North's, and as long as she received proper education, she would be fine. Moreover, the girl exhibited a faint magical aura. Wright had experimented with detecting magical fluctuations, and it seemed that only he had this ability. Renly was completely unaware of the magic within others, and perhaps it was a skill granted by his reincarnation. The Stark family carried the blood of the first men, with their warg abilities being a natural gift passed down through the generations, with varying strength. Upon further inspection, Wright deduced that this newborn's magic was not a warg ability, but rather a talent for utilizing magic in a different way. For instance, Renly's greatest magical talent was in healing, followed by alteration magic, and he found it easier to learn those spells compared to others. The Stark's warg abilities, on the other hand, would manifest naturally as they aged, and their magical power grew even without formal training. Wright withdrew his thoughts and walked to the window, summoning a sphere of ice into his hand. As he gazed at the birds flying across the sky, his mind drifted to the ravens. The Green Seer, he thought. He probably uses some form of space and time magic unique to this world. Whatever. I have my own means of self-defense now. Even if he tries to manipulate me through dreams to kill me, I'm not afraid anymore. I used to fear him, but as I grow older, my magic and physical strength are growing too. I've entered a realm beyond the ordinary. As long as he doesn't bother me, I won't go looking for him. But if he does, I'll make sure he regrets it. I won't hesitate to kill him. It took a month for Ashara's brother to reach God's grace, as the journey from Starfall was hampered by the desert and mountains. When he arrived, Wright spoke with the Dane family. I know who the father of the child is. He's an important person. If the child wants to know when she grows up, she can come to me. The little girl was the first person Wright had encountered in this world, aside from Renly, who exhibited magical abilities. Wright thought about how he might be able to train her properly in the future. Ashara's brother, upon hearing this, thought about Ashara's past relationships, and then recalled rumors about Wright's brother, King Robert. The more he thought about it, the more he felt it was possible. The royal bloodline. He immediately declared, "She's the only blood of my sister. She's my family now. From this day forward, she will be known as Ashara Dane II." He officially legitimized the bastard as part of House Dane. On the road back to Storm's End, Stannis Baratheon was busy assembling a new royal fleet, preparing for an assault on Dragonstone to root out the last remnants of House Targaryen. However, recently, a powerful storm had struck Dragonstone, and the former queen, who had given birth to Princess Daenerys on the island, had died from severe blood loss. The storm had also destroyed the Targaryen fleet and the ships of their bannermen. Yet, the storm had also claimed the lives of Stannis' scouts, so he was unaware that the Targaryen fleet had been destroyed and continued to build his ships in preparation for battle. By the time Stannis finished constructing his fleet and set sail, he discovered that the Targaryens no longer had any ships, only land forces defending the castle. After easily capturing Dragonstone, Stannis found only the Queen's tomb and learned that Prince Viserys and Princess Daenerys had already fled to the east. In 284 AC, Wright and Renly finally returned to Storm's End. King Robert sent word requesting that they come to King's Landing for a wedding. Without delay, the two set off for the capital. This was Wright's first time in King's Landing. Before his reincarnation, he had heard that the city stank, but upon arriving, he realized that some parts of the city were so foul-smelling they could bring tears to one's eyes. The Targaryen dynasty had been established almost 300 years ago, and the fishing village that stood before had been renamed King's Landing. The Red Keep, however, had only begun construction 35 years later. The city itself was beautifully designed, but the sewer system was grossly underdeveloped. With the population growing rapidly, now reaching around 500,000, the city's management had struggled to keep up, resulting in filth, disorder, and sewage flooding the streets. Only the area near the Red Keep, where the nobility resided, was relatively cleaner. After the procession entered the city, the carts slowly made their way toward the Red Keep. Wright looked out at the massive ruins atop a distant hill. That's the Dragon's Pit, Wright thought. Although it was in ruins, one could still imagine the grandeur of the original building. The main reason Wright had come to King's Landing was to inspect the bones of the dragons in the Red Keep, to see if there was any trace of their dragon souls. After all, these dragons had died over 100 years ago, and if any dragon souls remained, it would be a test of Wright's ability to absorb their power as a dragonborn. Upon entering the Red Keep, Wright and Renly made their way directly to Maegor's Holdfast to meet Robert. Passing through the grand halls of the Red Keep, which could easily hold 1,000 people, Wright couldn't help but be impressed. The Iron Throne towering above was far more magnificent than its portrayal in the show, grand and imposing. Wright noticed that the dragon skulls, which had originally been displayed on the walls of the hall, were gone, replaced by a large banner of the Baratheon stag with a golden background, likely hung there by Robert, who had probably thrown the dragon skulls into the dungeon. When they arrived in the king's study, Robert greeted his brothers with a hearty laugh. "I'm sorry to make you two wait. Let's see if you've lost any weight," he joked. "Big brother, you really are the king now," Renly said with surprise, taking in the grandeur of the legendary royal castle for the first time. Robert, now looking robust and full of vigor, was a far cry from the man he had been a year ago. His body was stronger, and the war had undoubtedly helped him mature. But despite the outward appearance of success, Robert was deeply dissatisfied with his marriage. Tywin Lannister had done what Robert wanted, but couldn't do, eliminating Rhaegar's children, his son and daughter. However, Tywin had not anticipated that the task would be carried out so viciously. Now, Dorne had made Robert their enemy. While Rhaegar's younger brother and sister had escaped, the royal line of succession had been effectively cut off. Tywin had taken the blame for Robert, and as part of the deal, Robert had married Cersei and allowed Jaime to remain a Kingsguard. "You two also helped with this," Robert continued with excitement. "I had you two come early because I wanted to discuss your rewards. I'm appointing Stannis as the Lord of Dragonstone, Renly as the Lord of Storm's End, and as for the members of House Buckwell, they're all almost dead. The survivors will be sent to the Wall. Right? I'm making you Lord of the Antlers in the Crownlands." "Why is second brother being sent to Dragonstone?" Renly asked, confused. Based on his education, the second brother should have inherited the family land. "You don't need to worry about that," Robert answered firmly. "His fief has already been decided." Wright understood the situation and knew that reasoning with Robert wouldn't change anything. He decided to speak up about his own plans. "After your wedding, I want to go to the Citadel to study for a few years. I really can't manage a fief. You can have the crown manage it for now." "Is it because you're unhappy with the fief?" Robert asked, slightly baffled. "Renly is inheriting the family estate, but you're only a boy. Who would trust you to advise? I'm rewarding you for your merit, but if I give you a significant fief, it might upset other soldiers. So, I'm giving you a land with no people to quiet those voices." Wright replied calmly, "I don't even want a fief right now. Isn't it better to focus on studying magic?" "Well, then you can go to the Citadel," Robert said. "But are you sure you want to give up the family name, not marry, and become some ascetic scholar? You'd ruin your betrothal to Dorne." Robert seemed taken aback, as it was not uncommon for younger sons in noble families to go off and study, but there was always the expectation to return and contribute to the family. Some did become scholars or even members of the Night's Watch. He worried that Wright might be influenced by someone else. "Of course not. I just want to study knowledge. After a few years, I'll leave. I'll come up with some excuse to drop out." Robert always felt that scholars were nothing more than ascetics, living their lives immersed in studies and devoid of joy. Was his brother too smart for his own good? "Big brother, do you remember Prince Oberyn of Dorne?" Wright said, his tone casual. "He forged 6 rings at the Citadel but dropped out and now lives freely and carefree." "Did he convince you to go to the Citadel?" Robert asked, worried that his brother had been influenced by Oberyn, especially after the recent war where Dorne had lost his uncle and sister. "Of course not," Wright replied. "I've only met him a few times in Dorne. I'm a mage, and I've hit a bottleneck. I need more knowledge to improve my magic, so I must go to the Citadel." "All right," Robert said, reluctantly conceding. "You've always been headstrong. I'll support you this time. If you want to return, just send me a letter, and I'll find a way to get you out of there without affecting your reputation." As the king, Robert had many legitimate ways to help Wright leave the Citadel if needed. "Thank you, big brother. There's one more thing I need your help with, something very important." Robert, sensing that this was serious, gave his full attention. "As king of the 7 kingdoms, what can I not do?" "Speak. Please clean up the filth in King's Landing. It smells terrible." Robert burst out laughing. "Ha ha! It really does stink. I'll take care of it," he said, with a grin. Though, when it came to handling the details, he'd leave it to his ministers. He didn't care how much money it took, as long as the job got done. Wright thought to himself, at least Robert's wasting money on something good for once. "One more thing, big brother. Where did you put the dragon skulls in the hall? Renly and I want to see them." "I'll have the guards take you there." Robert immediately agreed, then called for Varys, who was waiting outside, to come in and give him instructions. "Now that you're king, I no longer need to keep my magic a secret, but I won't announce it formally. I'll reveal it slowly at the right moment. Magic has been gone for hundreds of years, so people need time to accept it," Wright continued, glancing at Varys, who was standing nearby. He noticed that Robert's eyes shifted between him and Renly, realizing that Wright's magic was far stronger than Renly's. Robert then turned to Renly. Renly nodded. This was something he and Wright had agreed on beforehand. Wright's destruction magic had reached an intermediate level, but he had decided to keep it secret until he had mastered more. His time in Dorne had also made him realize that this world was far more complicated than he had originally believed. "That's fine. Your affairs are your own to manage. I'll support you unconditionally," Robert said. "Then, if there's nothing else, Renly and I will go see the dragon skulls," Wright said, eager to see them now that the matter had been settled. Chapter 15. The Dragon Soul. In Westeros, everyone grows up hearing tales of dragons. Anyone who has the means would want to see a dragon, even if only once. When Robert removed the dragon skulls from the Red Keep's Great Hall, it was to ensure his lords and courtiers would not be reminded of House Targaryen. This was now the age of the Baratheon dynasty. Sir Barristan Selmy, who took Wright and Renly to see the dragon skulls, was now 47 years old and serving as Lord Commander of King Robert's Kingsguard. Years earlier, he had accompanied Prince Rhaegar to Storm's End for a tourney and had shared a meal at the same table as Wright and Renly. Robert trusted Barristan far more than Jaime, who had only recently slain King Aerys. The King's Guard, once 7 strong, had been reduced to just Barristan and Jaime after the war claimed the lives of the other 5. A tourney would be held at Robert's wedding to select 5 new members to fill their ranks. House Selmy, bannermen of Storm's End, were loyal vassals of Robert. Barristan himself had served as a Kingsguard for the Mad King and had been caught between family loyalty and his sworn oaths during the rebellion. He chose to honor his vows and defend his king. Gravely wounded after the defeat at the Trident, he was nearly executed by Rose Bolton of the Dreadfort. However, Robert not only saved his life and tended to his injuries, but also pardoned him after taking the throne, appointing him as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. In doing so, Robert gained a loyal protector and spared the Selmy family the humiliation of seeing their kin dishonored, a testament to his knack for both strategy and leadership. Wright and Barristan spoke of their experiences in Dorne and the legendary Sword of the Morning, a former comrade now lost to death. Nostalgia tinged their conversation, though Barristan made no mention of magic, likely assuming Robert and Renly's earlier comments on the subject to be mere jest. The dungeons were empty, as they had been ever since Robert's amnesty. Those who deserved death had been executed, while others had been pardoned after his coronation. Before they even reached the dragon skulls, Wright felt a strange sensation. It wasn't the ripple of magic, but something entirely different, something entirely new. As they drew closer, he sensed another presence pressing against him. Turning a corner, still some distance from the skulls, they saw a ghostly dragon soul emerge from one of the larger skulls and streak toward Wright. The soul fused with his body, leaving a pulsing purple energy cluster in his mind. Wright glanced at Renly and Barristan, but neither appeared to notice anything unusual as they moved toward the skulls. It seemed matters of the soul were imperceptible even to practitioners of magic unless they specialized in soul-related arts or abilities. Baratheon held a torch aloft, while Renly, clearly enthralled, eagerly examined the various dragon skulls of differing sizes. He ran his hands over them in fascination, prompting Baratheon to caution him. "Careful. Dragon bones are hot to the touch." Renly, who had been learning fire magic and had been taught by Wright how to guard against intense heat, approached more cautiously this time. He managed not to burn himself. Wright absorbed the total of 7 dragons' souls. The souls of dragons that had been dead for too long or whose skulls were severely damaged had already dissipated. After absorbing the dragon souls, Wright began to observe the 18 skulls in the chamber, ranging in size. Recently deceased dragon bones were white and radiated immense heat. Over centuries, they gradually turned black. The skulls from which he had just absorbed the souls were a grayish-white, while the black skulls belonged to dragons that had died much earlier. The largest skull was likely that of Balerion, the Black Dread, who had lived for around 200 years before dying of old age. Dragons, once bonded to a rider, were incredibly loyal, following orders even to attack and kill their fellow dragons. However, upon their rider's death, they would accept a new rider. Balerion had been bonded to 4 different dragon riders during his life. Sir Barristan, noticing how captivated the 2 boys were, spoke. "Dragon bones are incredibly rich in iron and retain heat for a long time. Some have been used for decoration, and a few were crafted into dragonbone bows. However, it's said that using dragonbone items provokes the wrath of other dragons, so few dare to make such things." Wright, analyzing the dragon bones through his forging skills, thought, "When my forging skill reaches its peak, I'll try crafting a set of dragon bone armor and weapons. Let the dragons come seeking vengeance. Others may fear them, but as a dragonborn, I'm the bane of dragons. They'll only come to deliver their souls." After leaving the dungeons, Wright returned to Maegor's holdfast to rest. Normally, the holdfast was reserved for the king's family, while other nobles stayed elsewhere in King's Landing. However, since Robert's wedding had not yet taken place, and the Red Keep was underpopulated, Wright and Renly were allowed to stay there. That night, Wright looked up at the starry sky and let his consciousness drift into the heavens. The dragon shouts he had previously explored but found useless now had potential. With 7 dragon souls at his disposal, it was time to revisit their possibilities. In the world of the Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim, dragon shouts were a form of magic created by dragons using their language. Dragons could breathe fire, frost, and lightning, control weather, and summon entities using these shouts, their power far surpassing that of conventional magic due to their immense size and abundant magical energy. For a dragonborn, absorbing a dragon's soul was a prerequisite for using dragon shouts. The second critical requirement was understanding the dragon language and the words of power, inscribed as spells. In the game's lore, dragons had their own grammar and phonetics, as well as claw-carved runes on stone surfaces, some imbued with magical power. Dragon language was merely their means of communication, but the magical words of power formed the essence of dragon shouts. Casual dragon speech did not unleash magic, much like a mage's incantation only triggered magic when properly invoked. Otherwise, dragons chatting would turn the world into chaos. The deeper the understanding of the words of power, the greater the strength of the dragon shouts. In the game, absorbing dragon souls also transferred their knowledge. However, the souls Wright had just absorbed seemed to carry little more than a few basic dragon words, like fly, land, and fire. Wright deduced that the dragons of Westeros were practically illiterate in dragonkind's magic. The Targaryens, fluent only in Low Valyrian and having long lost High Valyrian and its magical traditions, had effectively raised their dragons as uneducated beasts, wasting their immense potential. Knowing that the 2 worlds he had merged into were far more intricate than the originals, Wright decided to focus on mastering Unrelenting Force, the signature shout of any dragonborn. However, he could only grasp the meaning of the first word of power. First word, force. He invested a dragon's soul into the word, feeling the knowledge and experiences tied to it flood his mind. A vision of a dragon whispering in his consciousness emerged, guiding him through the process. Turning to face his bed, Wright took a deep breath, channeling magic into his throat. The flow felt entirely different from other forms of magic he'd used before. Suddenly he shouted, "Force!" A visible wave of energy burst from his mouth. Pillows, blankets, and sheets flew through the air. Even the wooden bed frame screeched across the floor, pushed a full meter forward, the scraping noise grating against his ears. The result was promising. Fuss, meaning force, disrupted balance and created a powerful blast. However, the second and third words of the shout, row, balance, and da, push, remained incomprehensible. While Wright remembered their meaning from the game, this hardcore adaptation of the Game of Thrones world turned every word into a complex rule-based system. Injecting his consciousness into the remaining words revealed an overwhelming flood of unintelligible information. Undeterred, Wright decided to experiment again. He inhaled and shouted, "Fuss! Row! Da!" The same result followed. Pillows, sheets, and the bed moved exactly as before. Clearly, only the first word had any effect, as the others were not yet words of power, but merely spoken dragon language. Realizing the limitations of his understanding, Wright set the other shouts aside for now. He turned his gaze to the windowsill, where a raven had silently perched. The moment Wright noticed it, the raven preened its feathers as if pretending to be an ordinary bird, but Wright could sense the magical aura surrounding it. "Should I call you the three-eyed raven, or blood raven, Brynden Rivers?" Wright asked casually. Absorbing dragon souls must have altered the future, for now, the enigmatic raven had taken an interest in him. However, Wright, having stepped into the realm of the extraordinary, saw little threat from the three-eyed raven. Beyond manipulating dreams to sow discord, Brynden held no real power over him. The raven turned to stare at Wright. "Don't bother me, and I won't bother you," Wright said dismissively. When the raven showed no intention of leaving, Wright raised his hand and cast a light orb. The spell, a simple illumination charm with no offensive properties, produced a glowing orb that stuck to whatever it first touched until its magic was exhausted. The orb shot out, landing beside the raven's eye, its bright light glaring. The raven flapped its wings and cawed in protest, hopping in circles to shake the light off to no avail. With an indignant squawk, it flew off into the night. "Blinded your raven eye?" Wright called after it with a smirk. Wright deduced that the dragons of Westeros were practically illiterate in dragonkind's magic. The Targaryens, fluent only in Low Valyrian and having long lost High Valyrian and its magical traditions, had effectively raised their dragons as uneducated beasts, wasting their immense potential. Knowing that the two worlds he had merged into were far more intricate than the originals, Wright decided to focus on mastering unrelenting force, the signature shout of any dragonborn. However, he could only grasp the meaning of the first word of power. First word, force. He invested a dragon's soul into the word, feeling the knowledge and experiences tied to it flood his mind. A vision of a dragon whispering in his consciousness emerged, guiding him through the process. Turning to face his bed, Wright took a deep breath, channeling magic into his throat. The flow felt entirely different from other forms of magic he'd used before. Suddenly he shouted, "Fuss!" A visible wave of energy burst from his mouth. Pillows, blankets, and sheets flew through the air. Even the wooden bed frame screeched across the floor, pushed a full meter forward, the scraping noise grating against his ears. The result was promising. Fuss, meaning force, disrupted balance and created a powerful blast. However, the second and third words of the shout, row, balance, and da, push, remained incomprehensible. While Wright remembered their meaning from the game, this hardcore adaptation of the Game of Thrones world turned every word into a complex rule-based system. Injecting his consciousness into the remaining words revealed an overwhelming flood of unintelligible information. Undeterred, Wright decided to experiment again. He inhaled and shouted, "Fuss! Row! Da!" The same result followed. Pillows, sheets, and the bed moved exactly as before. Clearly, only the first word had any effect, as the others were not yet words of power, but merely spoken dragon language. Realizing the limitations of his understanding, Wright set the other shouts aside for now. He turned his gaze to the windowsill, where a raven had silently perched. The moment Wright noticed it, the raven preened its feathers as if pretending to be an ordinary bird, but Wright could sense the magical aura surrounding it. "Should I call you the three-eyed raven, or blood raven, Brynden Rivers?" Wright asked casually. Absorbing dragon souls must have altered the future, for now, the enigmatic raven had taken an interest in him. However, Wright, having stepped into the realm of the extraordinary, saw little threat from the three-eyed raven. Beyond manipulating dreams to sow discord, Brynden held no real power over him. The raven turned to stare at Wright. "Don't bother me, and I won't bother you," Wright said dismissively. When the raven showed no intention of leaving, Wright raised his hand and cast a light orb. The spell, a simple illumination charm with no offensive properties, produced a glowing orb that stuck to whatever it first touched until its magic was exhausted. The orb shot out, landing beside the raven's eye, its bright light glaring. The raven flapped its wings and cawed in protest, hopping in circles to shake the light off to no avail. With an indignant squawk, it flew off into the night. "Blinded your raven eye?" Wright called after it with a smirk. Chapter 16. Journey to Old Town. Wright understood that mastering magic in this world required a combination of accumulated knowledge and relentless practice. While his experience from another life allowed for quick progress with beginner spells, advancing to intermediate magic introduced entirely unfamiliar rules, causing his progress to slow significantly. To overcome this, Wright decided to journey to Old Town to learn more and uncover new methods for understanding this world that once thrived with magic. At the same time, he delved into the magical consciousness cluster, searching for books from the Elder Scrolls world. Perhaps he might even find a text on the Thu'um. The Red Keep's library was also a promising resource. It housed a vast collection of Targaryen books that had survived Tywin Lannister's sacking of the castle. While Tywin's men had looted gold and silver, they showed no interest in books, save for a few with jewel-encrusted covers, which had their bindings torn off. Wright believed the library likely contained texts about dragons, but the disorganized state of the collection made locating them a challenge. He also visited the Alchemist Guild to meet the pyromancers and inspect their wildfire. The pyromancers boasted that it was created through magic. Wright carefully examined a jar, sensing no magical resonance whatsoever. Based on its scent, color, and an alchemical analysis, he concluded that wildfire was a refined petroleum product, likely between gasoline and diesel, though heavily impure, which accounted for its green hue. In the days that followed, Wright and Renly were not permitted to attend the small council meetings, though they did represent House Baratheon at a general court session held in the Great Hall. Much of King's Landing, including the Red Keep, had been looted by Tywin Lannister's forces. With Dragonstone still unconquered, the immediate priority was to disband the gathered armies temporarily. Robert planned to reward his loyalists during his upcoming wedding, where the victors would also participate in a grand tourney. During the court session, Robert began by bestowing titles and rewards upon those who had distinguished themselves in the war. One by one, the war's heroes knelt before the new king of the Seven Kingdoms to receive their honors, symbolizing their formal oaths of fealty to Robert. The four most significant appointments were as follows. Tywin Lannister was named Warden of the West. Robert's close friend, Eddard Stark, was made Warden of the North. Jon Arryn, Robert's foster father, was confirmed as Warden of the East. Mace Tyrell was named Warden of the South. Other individuals were rewarded accordingly, making this a rare event in history, an occasion where so many benefited from a victory against dragons. Robert then announced the new small council appointments. Jon Arryn, previously the acting Hand of the King, was formally named Hand of the King. The position of Master of Coin remained vacant following the death of Chelsted, who had been burned alive by the Mad King for opposing his plan to burn the city. The role of Master of Laws also remained unfilled. Grand Maester Pycelle, who had facilitated the surrender of King's Landing, would remain in his position, though as a Maester of the Citadel, he could not receive a lordship. Varys, the Mad King's spy master, retained his position due to the valuable intelligence he'd provided to Robert. Next, Stannis Baratheon was named Lord of Dragonstone and Master of Ships, while Renly was granted Storm's End and made Lord of the Stormlands. Stannis was visibly furious at being passed over for the ancestral seat of House Baratheon. Meanwhile, Wright continued his studies within the castle. One day he came across a book on Valyrian language, and as he opened it, he was astonished by what he found. The common tongue of Westeros, as depicted in the Game of Thrones series, is English, while Valyrian spoken on Essos is incomprehensible to most Westerosi. But when he transmigrated into the world of Westeros, Wright found himself unable to understand the common tongue at first and had to learn it from childhood. However, Valyrian spoken in Essos turned out to be English, leaving him puzzled. What then is High Valyrian? He suddenly recalled the dragon soul he absorbed earlier, which had imparted a few words of the dragon language. Could it be that while regular Valyrian, English, is used for communication, High Valyrian is equivalent to the dragon language? Wright decided to consult Grand Maester Pycelle, who happened to be in the library. There are still many speakers of Valyrian English in Essos, Pycelle explained. But High Valyrian is essentially a dead language. Only a few relics engraved with it remain, and no one alive can interpret them. It is, for all intents and purposes, lost to time. Could the blending of these two worlds truly be so intricate, or were there deeper, unknown secrets at play? Wright delved into other Valyrian texts, discovering that with his advanced English proficiency, he could read them fluently. The texts were indeed written in English, albeit with some unique terms specific to this world. At the very least, this newfound foreign language proficiency would serve him well in Essos. During Robert's wedding and the subsequent tourney, Wright kept to himself, quietly organizing his thoughts on Valyrian in his mind. At the wedding, he observed the notable attendees. Tywin Lannister, beginning to bald, yet draped in an ostentatious gold-threaded cloak, constantly flaunting his family's wealth. Jaime was strikingly handsome, while Cersei's beauty was undeniably seductive, the type that could awaken desire at a glance, though remembering her future entanglements with Jaime left Wright grimacing. Tyrion stood near the banquet table conversing with Jaime, his head barely visible. Gregor Clegane, the Mountain, towered over everyone, his extraordinary size apparent despite his lack of giant's blood. Meanwhile, Jorah Mormont, still in his prime as Lord of Bear Island, looked content and self-assured. Rose Bolton, Lord of the Dreadfort, had a mild and unassuming demeanor, and Davos Seaworth, the Onion Knight, stood nearby, his fingers wrapped in bandages. Later that evening, Robert lost his temper, complaining that Cersei had sold the 5 vacant positions on the Kingsguard. It was only after Stannis informed him of the profits from the tourney that his mood improved. During the wedding, Robert also made announcements regarding changes to his family's hierarchy and territories. Robert, as the king of the 7 kingdoms and protector of the realm, retained control of the crown lands. His marriage to a Lannister had solidified ties between the Baratheons and Lannisters, prompting a change in the royal sigil to feature a crowned stag alongside a lion. Stannis, the second brother, was officially named Lord of Dragonstone and entrusted with the navy, ruling over Dragonstone, Claw Isle, and Driftmark. His sigil was updated to a crowned stag within a flaming red heart on a gold field. Renly, the elder of the Baratheon twins, and formerly the third in line to inherit the family title, was elevated to Lord of Storm's End and head of the Baratheon family. He retained dominion over the Stormlands, and his sigil remained the crowned stag on a gold field. Wright, the youngest twin, was granted the title of Lord of Antlers Keep in the Crownlands. However, until he reached his majority, the royal family would manage the estate on his behalf. His sigil was the crowned stag on a gold field, with an added flame burning atop the stag's head. Antlers Keep, a small military stronghold within the Crownlands, was a modest holding. Its former lord had perished in the rebellion, making it an easy prize for Robert to bestow upon his younger brother. None of the other nobles voiced any objections. Thus, the Baratheon brothers were formally divided into 4 separate branches. On his journey to Old Town, Wright planned to pass through Highgarden and decided to travel southward with the Tyrell family. Before leaving the Red Keep, he handed Robert a slip of paper filled with names. Each one belonged to someone he considered a potential threat. Figures like Grand Maester Picel and Littlefinger were on the list. The note contained no explanations, as many of these dangers stemmed from future events that only Wright knew about. He left it to Robert's judgment whether to act on the information. For now, these individuals were minor players, and if the king wanted them gone, he could easily fabricate a reason. The Tyrells had been warmly received at Robert's wedding despite their prior allegiance to the Targaryens. Their covert dealings with Robert during the rebellion had earned them his favor. Mace Tyrell was named Warden of the South, and Robert appointed several Tyrells to key positions in the royal administration, a decision likely influenced by the house's immense wealth. Though the Lannisters of the Westerlands were famously wealthy, so wealthy that the saying went they shit gold, Wright knew the Tyrells' wealth was far more sustainable. The Westerlands' riches came from their gold and silver mines, which were undoubtedly nearing depletion, and the region likely engaged in illicit coin minting. In contrast, the Reach's wealth stemmed from its fertile lands, abundant rivers, and favorable climate. Even common farmers could afford the luxury of planting flowers, a testament to the region's prosperity. Unlike mining, agriculture provided an enduring economic foundation, making the Tyrells' wealth truly unparalleled. Mace Tyrell, unimpressed by minor court appointments, returned to Highgarden with his family. Accompanying him were his sons, Willis and Garland, as well as the true power behind Highgarden, Olenna Redwine. At 56 years old, Olenna was still spry and energetic, often taking her grandsons on leisurely walks whenever the group stopped at an inn. Wright admired Olenna's sharp intellect and enjoyed conversing with clever people. However, Olenna had a troubling habit. Her demeanor shifted drastically with her mood. When pleased, she was witty and charming. When displeased, she wielded her sharp tongue without restraint. In settings where she held sway, she openly insulted others. In other domains, she tempered her words but could still leave her targets speechless with her barbed remarks. This earned her the nickname Queen of Thorns among the nobility. Unwilling to spend too much time in Olenna's company, Wright often secluded himself in the carriage, nursing his 2 missing front teeth and immersing himself in Valyrian studies. Yet, there were occasions when he had no choice but to face her. Chapter 17. Old Town. The Rose Road, connecting Highgarden to King's Landing, took at least 10 days to traverse on horseback. Along the way, inns dotted the roadside, offering travelers a chance to rest and dine before continuing their journey the next day. Seating arrangements during meals followed an unspoken hierarchy. Soldiers dined together, knights at another table, while lords and their ladies shared a separate table. The Tyrells of Highgarden, as the highest-ranking nobles present, occupied their own table. As the younger brother of the King of the Seven Kingdoms and the newly appointed Lord of Antler's Keep, Wright had no choice but to join them. During one dinner, Olenna Tyrell, vexed by Wright's deliberate avoidance of her, decided to provoke the boy. She elegantly cut a piece of meat and placed it on his plate. "I've heard you're betrothed to a bastard girl. You'd better eat more now, as there might not be much meat on your plate after the wedding," she remarked. 10-year-old Willis and the chubby Garland sensed danger and quickly buried their heads in their meals, hoping to avoid drawing Olenna's ire. Wright looked at Olenna, puzzled. What's that supposed to mean? "Don't worry, fuck. T.A. isn't a bastard daughter anymore," he replied, deliberately mumbling and letting his missing front teeth show, making it clear he couldn't speak properly. With a mischievous grin, he quickly followed the Tyrell brothers' example, focusing on his food and planning his escape. Unbothered, Olenna continued, "And what about Robert? Did he send you off to become a Maester?" "I must study for a time," Wright replied, his speech still slurred. "Isn't that what many nobles do?" Olenna raised an eyebrow. Initially dismissing Wright as an ordinary 6-year-old, she now began to notice something different about him. During the royal wedding, he had remained silent, but now she sensed a sharper mind at work. As Olenna prepared to probe further, Wright hastily finished his meal, muttered, "Apologies, toothache," and bolted from the inn. "He's still just a child, no matter how noble. Just receive him politely." "What's the point of talking so much with him?" Mace Tyrell commented between mouthfuls of food, clearly unimpressed by his mother's interest in Wright. "That boy is already at the Citadel at 6, Olenna retorted, her tone sharp. "And you, Mace, how many letters could you write at that age? All you did was eat like a bottomless pit." Willis and Garland exchanged glances, struggling to suppress their laughter. They knew their grandmother's temperament all too well. No one escaped her barbs, though they also knew her sharp tongue concealed a deep love for her family. Mace Tyrell's arrogance, short-sightedness, and lack of political cunning made Olenna the true power behind Highgarden. Her extensive network kept her better informed than her son, but as his mother, she felt compelled to offer advice. "There's a rumor in King's Landing that the original betrothal was for Renly, but Wright insisted it be changed to himself. I've also noticed the books he reads are written in Valyrian. The boy is sharp, but Robert hasn't mentioned this at all, which suggests he's deliberately protecting him." Turning to her grandsons, Olenna added, "You two should seize any opportunity to build a good relationship with him." "Yes, grandmother," they replied in unison, knowing better than to disagree. After parting ways with the Tyrells at Highgarden, Wright's entourage continued along the Rose Road until they reached their destination, Old Town. Despite its name, Old Town was the largest city in all of Westeros. Situated at the mouth of the Honeywine River, the city's most striking feature was the towering High Tower. Serving both as a lighthouse and as the seat of House Hightower, Wright estimated it to be nearly 300 meters tall, almost rivaling the Oriental Pearl Tower of his former world. However, the High Tower was far sturdier, befitting its purpose as a military stronghold. Legend attributed its construction to Brandon the Builder, who had also raised the wall in the north. Some claimed it was built by a different Brandon of the same name. Regardless of its origins, the High Tower remained an awe-inspiring sight. The other prominent structure in Old Town was the Starry Sept, the former seat of the High Septon of the Faith of the Seven. However, that seat had been moved to the Great Sept of Baelor in King's Landing. The Citadel, in contrast, lacked a singular grand structure. Instead, it resembled a cluster of buildings, much like a university campus in the modern world. Old Town stood in stark contrast to King's Landing. While the capital was notoriously filthy and chaotic, Old Town was clean and well organized, with numerous canals crisscrossing the city, allowing merchant ships to sail directly into its heart. Wright's first stop in Old Town was the High Tower, the seat of House Hightower. House Hightower was the most powerful house in the Reach. Its current head, Lord Leighton Hightower, had previously attended tournaments at Storm's End and was a familiar face. Lord Leighton's third daughter, Aleri, was married to Mace Tyrell, making her the mother of Willis, Garland, Loras, and Margaery. Building a good relationship with the High Towers was a logical first step, given Wright planned to stay in Old Town for several years. Though Lord Leighton remained in King's Landing, his heir, Sir Baelor Hightower, welcomed Wright warmly and even hosted a small banquet in his honor. The following day, Baelor assigned his younger brother, Gunthor Hightower, the ninth-born of the family, to escort Wright to the Citadel. Gunthor was also studying there, making him a suitable guide. Lord Leighton's remarkable fertility was a well-known topic. Gunthor, his 7th or 8th name day, was born to Leighton's 4th wife. The family even had a 10th-born sibling. Unlike Walder Frey, who focused on sheer numbers regardless of quality, the Hightower siblings were renowned for their good looks. Their handsome sons and beautiful daughters were a stark contrast to the infamous unattractiveness of Frey offspring, a fact widely acknowledged by the nobility. As Wright and Gunthor made their way through Old Town, they chatted about the city, with Wright praising its urban planning. Hearing such compliments about the family's legacy filled Gunthor with pride. "My brother mentioned you're studying Eastern languages. Do you know High Valyrian?" Wright inquired, curious about the subject. "I'm currently studying the Summer Isles language," Gunthor replied. "I've never studied High Valyrian. At the Citadel, anything related to Valyria is looked down upon. Realizing Gunther wasn't knowledgeable about Valyrian, Wright shifted the conversation. I need to buy a small house in Old Town. I'll stay at the Citadel, but my guards will need a place to live during these years. Do you know where I can find one? Gunther thought for a moment. I usually stay within the Citadel, so I'm not familiar with such matters. However, there's a merchant who deals in real estate and has close ties with our family. We can ask him. That sounds reliable. Let's go. At the merchant's establishment, Gunther exchanged pleasantries before Wright explained his needs. I need a house near the Citadel that can accommodate my guards. Do you have anything suitable? The merchant, ever polite, immediately recognized Wright as a noble from his demeanor. Still, seeing such a young buyer gave him pause, as houses accommodating 20 people were no small investment. He looked to Gunther for confirmation. I am Renly Baratheon, Lord of Antler's Keep, and younger brother to King Robert of the Seven Kingdoms. I'll purchase the house myself, so you need not worry about the funds, Wright clarified. Ah, Lord Wright, I do have 3 suitable properties. Allow me to show them to you. Wright brothers had each contributed to his expenses for his time at the Citadel. Renly, despite still being a child, had provided the most funds, as he was now the wealthiest of the siblings, holding the title of Lord of Storm's End. Robert, meanwhile, was still recovering from the lavish expenses of his coronation and wedding, while Stannis had already exhausted Dragonstone's meager resources. After visiting the 3 properties, Wright purchased a 3-story house by the water. With over 10 rooms, it could easily house his guards 2 to a room, with extra space to spare. Wright planned to sell the property when he left the Citadel in a few years, confident he could turn a profit as long as Old Town avoided war or plague. Renting, he reasoned, was a waste of money, and real estate investment was always a better option. He reserved the largest room for himself for when he stayed outside the Citadel, leaving day-to-day management to his captain of the guard. The guards were tasked with organizing themselves. Watching them work, Wright reflected on their role. These guards, handpicked by Robert, were loyal, but lacked exceptional skills. At this stage, Wright didn't truly need protection. The only threats to him were poisons, dragons, or supernatural forces. In such cases, even the guards would be of little help. He might even end up protecting them instead. For now, they served more as attendants and symbols of his status as a royal noble. After giving his final instructions to the captain of his guards, Wright set off with Gunther toward the Citadel. Under the current customs, once a noble reached 10 and 6 name days, they could start gathering their retinue and building their own household. Wright, however, wasn't in a rush. He was focused on developing himself as a battle mage, and had yet to fully master his own path. The Citadel, located along the banks of the Honeywine River, served as both a place of learning for Meisters and the administrative center for their order across the 7 kingdoms. It bore a strong resemblance to a modern university. As they walked, Gunther explained the Citadel's structure. The Citadel only accepts men. New arrivals are called novices. Once they choose a discipline, they become acolytes. There are more than a dozen fields of study here. Acolytes forge links of the corresponding metals to form their chains. Once they complete their chain and swear to forsake their family name, forgo marriage, and vow not to father children, they are granted the title of Maester. This world already had 3 professions that required individuals to renounce their identities: the Night's Watch, the Kingsguard, and the Maesters. Wright couldn't help but reflect on this system. It was clearly designed by the noble houses to curb any potential power these groups could amass. Ultimately, it was a consequence of the world's lagging productivity. As a traveler from another world, Wright felt both resigned and reflective as he considered this. Even in the most advanced societies, inheritance often brought strife. Disputes over property or shares were common enough. In a place as feudal and underdeveloped as Westeros, such issues were even more pronounced. Gunther continued his explanation. Once someone earns the title of Maester, they can be dispatched to serve a lord. The Citadel maintains permanent neutrality, so Maesters rarely participate directly in warfare. Lords pay for their services, which helps keep the Citadel running. Occasionally, a maester's significant contributions to a lord's cause result in large donations. Novices can also earn extra coin by doing tasks at the scribe's hearth. By now, they had reached the gates of the citadel. On either side stood statues of sphinxes. Wright eyed the statues curiously. Sphinxes were clearly rooted in ancient Egyptian mythology, yet here they were in Westeros. The mysteries of this world continued to intrigue him. Beyond the gates lay the scribe's hearth, a bustling area filled with stalls. Merchants and commoners alike came here to commission novices to draft wills, write letters, or send correspondence. Books and maps were also sold in abundance. A postal service, Wright mused. Though these transactions seemed modest, he understood that they collectively constituted a significant enterprise. "We'll head to the Seneschal's court first to register your chosen field of study," Gunther said. "But be warned, any research related to magic is scorned here." Materialists, Wright thought. Such an attitude might have been acceptable in his former world, but here, where magic and dragons were real, it seemed short-sighted. A true balance of magic and technology would yield far greater results than relying solely on the latter while suppressing the former. Thus began Wright's 4-year journey at the Citadel. 4 years. The same duration as a modern university degree, excluding medicine. He sighed. 4 years here, 4 years there. He couldn't bear the thought of any more.